Continuing with Diana Unveiled from Devil Worship in France are the Question of Lucifer, a record of things seen and heard in the secret societies, according to the evidence of initiates. And let's see. For the mendacious history confuses two entirely distinct persons, Eugenius and Arenaeus Philalethes. It is true that this confusion has been made frequently, and with names like that, who can blame them? And it is also true that at the beginning of my researches into the archaeology of Hermetic literature, I was one of its victims, for which I was sharply brought to book by those who knew better. But a young and unassisted investigator, imperfectly equipped, has an excuse which will exonerate him for at least a malicious intention. It is otherwise with a pretended family history, when documents of this kind reproduce blunders which are pardonable to ignorance alone, and upon a subject about which two opinions are no longer possible. It is certain that such documents are not what they claim. In other words, they have been fabricated, and the fabrication of historical papers is essentially a work of malice. Furthermore, when such forgeries impeach persons long since passed to their account, on the score of unheard of crimes, they are the work of diabolical malice, and this is a moderately worded judgment on the case now in hand. Thomas Vaughan, otherwise Eugenius Philalethes, was born in the year 1621 of the Common Era at Newton in Buckinghamshire. The accepted and perfectly correct authority for this statement is the Athenaea Oxoniensis of Anthony Wood, but he is not the only authority, and if he be not good enough for Miss Vaughan, she can take in his place the exhaustive researches of the Reverend A.B. Grossart, whose edition of the works of the Silurist Henry Vaughan have probably been neither seen nor heard of by this unwise woman. In the same way that she is ignorant of the most essential elements in the matters which she presumes to treat, the authority of a laborious scholar like Dr. Grossart will probably be of greater weight than the foul narrative of a Palladian memoir maker, who has not produced her documents from the date it follows that in the year 1636 Thomas Vaughan was still in the schoolboy period, not even of a sufficient age to begin a college career. He could not, as alleged, have visited Flude, the illustrious Kentish mystic, in London, nor would he have been ripe for initiation, supposing that Flude could have dispensed it. In like manner, Andrea, assuming that he was Grand Master of the Rosicrucians, would not have welcomed a youngster of 15 years, supposing that in those days he was likely to travel from London to Stuttgart, but he would have recommended him to return to his lesson books. The first voyage to America and all the earlier incidents of the narrative are untrue. For the same reason, in place of wandering through Denmark, The Hague, and Sweden, initiating and being initiated, he was drumming through a course at Oxford. In place of pious pilgrimages to the shrine of Socinus, he was preparing to take orders in the English church, and the narrative, which is untrue to his early, is untrue also to his latter life. After receiving holy orders, he returned to his native village and took over the care of its souls. He was never a Puritan. He was never a friend of Cromwell. He was a high churchman and a royalist, and he was ejected from his living because he was accused by political enemies of carrying arms for the king. He never traveled. On the contrary, he married. At what period is unknown, but his tender devotion to his wife is commemorated on the reverse pages of an autograph alchemical manuscript now in the British Museum, which belies, furthermore, in every line and word, the Luciferian imposture of the Peri Comienki documents by its passionate religious aspiration and adoring love of Christ. Certainly there can be a Luciferian Christian. But it's harder for Christians than perhaps other groups. When Vaughan came to London, it was as a man who was somewhat out of joint with English, in spite of his Oxford career, because he was a Welsh-speaking man, and when he took to writing books, he apologizes for his awkward diction. He accentuates also his youth, which would be warrantable at the age of 28, but would be absurd in a writer approaching 40 years. This point may be referred by anyone who will refer to my edition of Vaughan's Anthroposophia Theomagica. The works of Thomas Vaughan, besides Anthroposophia Theomagica, are Anima Magica Abscondita, published in 1650, Magia Adamica, 1650, apparently forgotten by the authentic documents of Miss Vaughan, as are also the Man Mouse and the Second Wash, are the more scoured once more. Satires on Henry More, written in reply to that Platonist who had attacked the previous books. These belong to the year 1651, as also does Lumen de Lumine, the Fame and Confession of the Fraternity R.C. Remember, I wrote an article, what does R.C. Christian really have to say about the Georgia Guidestones? But that's something much later. 1980, I think, was when they finally had those things put down. Appeared in 1652, not 1659, as the family history affirms. Alla Lucas, 1652, not 1651, and Euphrates, 1655. What is obvious everywhere in these priceless little books is the devotion of a true mystic to Jesus Christ, and to gift them with the sordid interpretation of a French-born cultist of Lucifer is about as possible to attribute a Christian intention to the calumnies of Mrs. Vaughan's documents. The year 1665, at the house of the rector of Albury, a chemical experiment with mercury cost the Welsh alchemist his life, and he was burned in the churchyard of that village in Oxfordshire. Yeah, the day when scientific experiments could get you killed, and not just because you dug up the body of a saint or something like that, where you might be able to understand the people's overreaction resulting. It is clear, therefore, that the wonderful archives in the possession of Mrs. Vaughan give a bogus history of Eugenius Philalethes, but they are also untrue of Irenaeus. It is untrue that this mysterious adept, whose identity has never been disclosed, was born in 1612. He was born some 10 years later. The source of both dates is the open entrance to the closed palace of the king, but that which Miss Vaughan champions is based upon a corrupt reading and a bad version, and she has evidently never seen the original and best of the Latin impressions that of Langius, though she has the presumption decided, and that edition establishes that he wrote the treatise in the year 1645, he being then in the 23rd year of his age, whence it follows that the date of his birth was most probably 1622, and the history with which he is investigated by Mrs. Vaughan is again a misfit. It is putting man's garments on a boy. Furthermore, there is not one item in her statements concerning the open entrance which was not directly and provably false. It was not printed, as she indicates, under the supervision of the author. It was not printed from the original manuscript, nor was that manuscript returned to Philalethes after it has passed through the press. It is a shame It is shameful for any person, male or female, however little they may consider their own fair fame, to do so far violate the canons of literary honor as to make dogmatic statements concerning a work which they cannot have seen. The preface prefixed to this edition by Langius completely refutes Mrs. Vaughan. Here is a passage in point. Truly, who or what kind of person was the author of this sweet, must-like work, I know no more than he who is most ignorant, nor since he himself would conceal his name, do I think fit to inquire so far, lest I get his displeasure. Again, to pick out the roses from the most thorny bushes of writings, and to make the elixir of philosophers by his own industry, without any tutor, and at 23 years of age, this perchance hath been granted to none, or to most few hitherto. Langius, moreover, laments explicitly the fact that he did not print from an original manuscript. He printed from a Latin translation, the work of an unknown hand, which had come into his possession, as he tells us, from a man who was learned in such matters. Mrs. Vaughan's pretended autograph, with its despicable marginal readings, is obviously a Latin copy. Whatever be its history otherwise, the original was in English, and when Langius was regretting its loss, a transcript probably written from the author's copy, or very little corrupted, was in possession of the bookseller William Cooper of Little St. Bartholomew's, near Little Britain, in the city of London, who published it in the year 1669, to correct the imperfections in the edition of Amsterdam. This transcript also establishes that the open entrance was penned when the author was in his 23rd year. As a matter of fact, Philalethes does not appear to have superintended the publication of any of his writings, and here Mrs. Vaughan again exhibits her unpardonable ignorance concerning the works with which she is dealing. To prove that her reputed ancestor was alive after the accepted date of Thomas Vaughan's death, she triumphantly observes that in the year 1668 he published his experiments on the preparation of Sophic mercury and Tractatus Tres, but the latter volume was a piracy, for in his preface to Ripley Revised, the author expressly laments that 2 of its 3 treatises had passed out of his hands, and he feared lest they should get into print, because they were imperfect works. Preceding the period of solid knowledge which produced the open entrance, again, so little was he consulted over the appearance of the Sophic mercury that the printer represents it as the work of an American philosopher, whence it has been fathered upon George Starkey. Irenaeus Philalethes was undoubtedly a great traveler, and he visited America, but there is no grounds for supporting that he was ever in Italy, and that either he or Thomas Vaughan edited the works of Socinus is an ignorant fiction, for which even Miss Vaughan can find no better warrant than the evasive place of publication, which figures on the title page of the Bibliotheca Fratrum Paulorum, namely Irenaeopolis. In like manner, she erroneously credits him with the authorship of the Medulla Alchemica, which is the work of Irenaeus Philoponus Philalethes, otherwise George Starkey. These facts fully establish the fraudulent nature of Miss Vaughan's family history, by whomsoever it has been devised, and seeing that where it is possible to check it, breaks down at every point, we need have no hesitation in rejecting the information which it proves in those cases which it cannot be brought to book. The connections of Faustus Succinus with the Rosicrucian fraternity as founder is one instance, and this is merely an extension of the imposture of Abbe Lefranc in his Veil Raised for the Curious, and it rests, like its original, on no evidence which can be traced. Another is the Rosicrucian imperatorship of Andrea, and yet another is the initiation of Robert Flude. Again, the connection of Philalethes with John Frederick Helvetius is based on speculation only, and that of Ashmole with the institution of symbolic masonry has never been more than hypothesis, and is not very deserving at that. I regret to add that on the authority of her bogus documents, Miss Vaughan has given currency to a rumor that the founder of the Ashmolean Museum poisoned his first wife. She deserves the most severe reprobation for having failed to test her materials before she made public this foul slander. Furthermore, in that portion of her materials which is concerned with her family history, she is not above tampering with the sense of printed books. The worshippers of Lucifer are represented as invariably terming their divinity the good God. Dio bon, or our God, Notre Dio. Dieu bon, Notre Dieu, is that how you say it? To distinguish him from the god of the Adonites, and the reference made to the deity by Philalethes in the open entrance she falsely translates by these Luciferian equivalents, thus creating an impression in the minds of the ignorant that he is not speaking of the true divinity. After this, it will hardly surprise my readers that a pretended translation from a manuscript of Guillermet de Beauregard, which she states to be preserved in the archives of the Sovereign Patriarchal Council of Hamburg, is simply stolen from an Instruction à Lefranc sur la vérité de l'histoire des frères de la Rosicruce by Gabriel Naudé, who ridiculed and revived the order. I submit in conclusion that, in view of the facts already elicited, it is not worthwhile to inquire into the value of the episode concerned with the judicial murder of Archbishop Laud, and to elaborately argue that Oliver Cromwell was the last person in England to be implicated in such a transaction. He, at the period in question, was briskly employed in checkmating his king, who was at Oxford in wintered quarters, and having neither the power nor opportunity to meddle with the details of an execution. The incident, in a word, is worth as much and as little as the abominable story of the subsequent pact with Lucifer, or the foolery of the mystic marriage. And I think we will finish this in a third program. Lux et Nox, Nox et Lux.